The night was drawn out and gloomy. As always at this time of year, the dark corridors of the hospital were plunged into a dead silence, interrupted only by the rare sounds of footsteps of guards and the occasional screams of patients. So it was a strange place, a closed psychiatric hospital located on the outskirts, surrounded by forest. Rarely did anyone end up here by accident, but this time everything was different. Andrei did not know how he ended up here. He only remembered that he was walking home after work, and suddenly a black car abruptly stopped in front of him. Everything happened too quickly. A jolt, a pain in the back of his head, and then emptiness. When he came to, he was lying on a hard bed in a small white room without windows. It was clearly a ward, which meant that he was in a hospital, but something was wrong. There was a knock on the door. Before he could answer, the door opened slightly, and a young nurse with an empty look entered the room. Her face seemed expressionless, as if emotions had left it long ago. She didn't say a word, only handed him some clothes and gestured towards the door. So Andrei obediently got dressed and went out into the corridor. On either side of him were similar doors, all equally white, without numbers or any identifying marks. "What is this place?" he muttered, but there was no answer. The corridors seemed endless. They turned in different directions, sometimes bifurcated, and sometimes even seemed to end in dead ends. In Andrei's head, a feeling arose that this place was living its own life, as if the walls were changing their outlines, adjusting to the presence of people. He looked around, trying to remember the way, but soon realized that it was useless. Everything here looked the same, monotonous and frightening. Finally, he reached the central hall. Here, unlike the corridors, there were a few people, patients sitting on benches, and several doctors in white coats. He decided to ask one of the doctors what was going on. "Excuse me, where am I?" he asked a middle-aged man who stood with his back to him. The doctor turned around slowly, as if resisting the need to answer. His eyes were filled with a strange emptiness, but something in his gaze made Andrei take a step back. "You're in a safe place," the doctor said, his voice low and cold. "Don't worry, we'll take care of you." "But I shouldn't be here. This is some kind of mistake," Andrei began, but the doctor just chuckled and pointed to one of the benches. "Sit down. Your place is here." Andrei felt a strange tremor in his body. He was no longer sure that he wanted to insist on his own. The atmosphere here was getting thicker with every minute, and he realized that this place was not just a hospital. Left alone on the bench, Andrei began to notice strange things happening around him. The patients seemed too quiet, as if they knew something but were afraid to speak. Some of them had strangely disfigured faces or bodies, while others looked too calm for a mental hospital. At night, he became even more afraid. The doors of the wards began to creak quietly, open and close by themselves. Footsteps were heard in the corridors, although no one was visible. He heard strange whispers that came from somewhere behind the walls, and he felt that someone or something was watching him. His attempts to talk to other patients about what was happening led to nothing. They avoided direct answers. Their eyes darted from side to side, as if they were afraid of being watched. After a few days, Andrei decided to escape. He could no longer stay in this place, in this trap. However, each of his escapes ended in failure. He ran along the corridors, climbed floors, tried to leave through the windows, but all in vain. The building seemed to adapt to his attempts to escape, turning his efforts into a game from which there was no way out. Finally, one night he heard a scream. This scream was not like all the previous ones. It came from somewhere below, from the underground floors that were closed to ordinary patients. Taking the risk, Andrei made his way down. With each step, the scream became louder and more piercing, until finally he reached a massive iron door. There was no lock on it, and to Andrei's surprise, it opened easily. In front of him was a long, dark tunnel leading into the unknown. The walls were covered in rust and moisture, and the air was saturated with dampness and something else, an unpleasant, sweetish smell of rotting flesh. Overcoming his fear, Andrei moved forward. At the end of the tunnel was a huge room, dimly lit by lamps hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the room, chained to a table, lay a man, and around him stood figures in white coats, doctors, but their faces were no longer human. They looked like monsters, distorted and disfigured, like the result of a failed experiment. Andrei froze in place. He realized that this hospital was a cover for something terrible. This was a place where monsters controlled people, experimented on them, turning patients into something inhuman. "Welcome to the center," a voice rang out from behind him. The doctor he had spoken to on the first day. "You were chosen to become one of us." Realizing there was no other way out, Andre rushed to the exit, but the doors closed in front of him. He was surrounded by monsters, ready to finish what he had started. One last thought flashed through his mind. Was all of this really predetermined from the very beginning?